And so I think that this crisis may, amongst other things, provide grounds for advancing goals of a social democratic character. And another piece of good news, I have to admit, this next piece of good news is more speculative, but I suggest that as the world economy recovers from about 2015 onwards, the world, and Iceland also, are likely to experience some 2 to 3 decades of fairly stable growth, during which time, and this is the really important point, during which time productive capital, production capital, capital which is oriented towards making goods and services, rather than financial capital, will be dominant through this period, as production capital was dominant in the Western world from the end of the Second World War through to the early 1980s. I think we will return to such a period, and production capital will be much more supportive of the welfare state, of public infrastructure investment, and so on, than finance capital has been over the past 3 decades. Now let me come to Iceland. I will post on the website a longer text than I'm going to talk to. I'm going to skip sections from the prepared text, but the first section I will go over now, and it is called, "Was the crisis in Iceland inevitable, even without a global crisis?" And the answer is yes. I want to begin by reporting to you what Peter Blundell, one of your favorite politicians, what Peter Blundell said just last night. He was talking to a parliamentarian from a friendly country, I better not say which one, but a friendly country which Iceland is very, very dependent on now for help. And in the course of this conversation, Peter Blundell told the parliamentarian that the crisis in Iceland was due entirely to the crisis in the United States. And he produced a list of 12 causes that the Independence Party had prepared to explain the crisis in Iceland, 12, of which exactly 4 had anything to do with Iceland, and 8 had to do with the United States. So he presented Iceland as an innocent victim of a crisis that came from elsewhere. The visiting parliamentarian looked at him in disbelief. And he thought to himself privately, he didn't say this, but he thought to himself privately that if this is the level of thinking of somebody who's been in the Helsinki for 30 years and is chair of the Economic and Economic and Tax Committee of the Helsinki, then he thought Iceland had some very serious structural problems. My argument is Iceland would have had a major financial crisis even without a global crisis, and for 2 main reasons. First of all, the very idea of making Iceland an international banking center was crazy from the start. And it was particularly crazy given the size of Iceland, given that it had its own currency, and given that it had free capital movements in and out. This was a recipe for disaster. The Baltics have certainly been badly hit by this crisis too. They are heavily in debt. The big difference between them and Iceland is that they were not trying to make themselves an international financial center, and the banks operating in the Baltics were not primarily domiciled in the Baltics. They were foreign banks, and therefore they had foreign lender of last resort support. And the second reason is really important why Iceland would have experienced a major crisis. And that is because the economy over the 2000s had come to be based on a phony or simply unviable growth model. The growth model consisted of the government setting high interest rates, allowing free inflows and outflows of capital. So high interest rates attracted in lots of foreign capital to get advantage of the high interest rates. This pushed up the krona. This kept imports relatively cheap. And of course, it also made it very cheap for Icelanders themselves to borrow abroad. And so when I came here in the mid-2000s, I began to be just amazed at how Icelanders were borrowing as though there was no tomorrow. I was reminded of what would happen if my tailor who makes my suits, actually, as my partner will tell you, I have no suits, but suppose I had suits and a tailor who made them. If my tailor was prepared to go on making me suits indefinitely and giving me the credit to buy them with, then I would go on buying the suits, and I would build up an enormous collection of suits, and I would be the admiration of all my friends for my many splendid suits. The only problem would come when the tailor asked me to repay the suits. And then I would be in difficulty and I might have to sell the suits at fire sale prices. And that's what the situation that Iceland is now facing. In a sense then, Iceland's problem is not the current crisis. The problem is how to scale down from what was a phony or fake or unviable consumption level of the past decade to a sustainable consumption level for the next decade. Icelanders have been enjoying a nearly free lunch, and at the end of the day, even as economists know, there is no free lunch. Let me skip the next two sections. One of them, the next one's called, Could the government have taken preemptive action to soften the crisis, to give a soft landing? And the answer is very clearly yes, if they were listening. The next section, which I'll also skip, is the very sensitive one of who is accountable. Who is accountable? What I want to talk about is what I think the government should do now. As I said before, for the next few months, there is some breathing room, but around about May, Iceland is going to have to refinance some pretty big debt, and the terms on which this debt is refinanced depends quite a lot on what is done now. So, some immediate steps.